Hello, everyone. Yesterday we got through the executive branch up through the Electoral College, which is here, and I just wanted to do a real quick review. The Electoral College is important to know, not just for an AP test in school or something, but as an American citizen. And as we'll talk about here in a little bit, much of the world sort of looks at our system, as do many Americans, and go, "What the heck is that? It's not a democratic system at all to elect a president." You remember that running through these bullets that the number of electoral votes per state is equal to the number of senators plus House members, so the minimum you can have as a state is 3. There are 538 total electoral votes, and there is the formula. The reason we do actually go vote at the polls is because whichever candidate gets the most popular votes, most regular votes in the state's election, gets all of the electoral votes from that state, like at least the party does, in 48 of 50 states. So Maine and Nebraska, we talked about Maine the other day, and we'll talk about Nebraska today. They do it a little differently. To win the presidential election, you need 270 electoral votes, which is a majority. And if you don't have 270, then the election goes to the House of Representatives, where they'll decide the president by having 1 vote per state. So that's that system. Now, the election of 1800. Now, one thing is that system that I'm explaining there, that I laid out, is the system that the way it is now after the 12th Amendment. The system was very different originally in the original Constitution of 1787. So, and the fault with this was seen very quickly. Basically, what happened was, the way it was originally was every elector got 2 electoral votes, and whichever person got the most electoral votes was president, and whoever got the second most was vice president. So in theory, what the thinking was let's say that in 2020 it's Trump and Biden running against each other, then maybe if electors thought that the best candidates were the 2 vice presidential candidates, they could vote for the 2 vice presidential candidates, and whichever one got more could end up being the president and the other one vice president. So it didn't have to be necessarily the president. What they didn't really foresee was, if I just put this in today's terms, and let's say that there is a Democratic president and a vice president, and then there's the Republican president and vice president. They were thinking someone could vote for, one president and the other presidential candidate or whatever. But when it comes to political parties in today's world and back then, if you had 2 electoral votes and you were a Democratic elector, you're going to go 1-2. Another Democratic elector is going to go 1-2. The Republican elector is going to go 1-2. A Democratic elector is going to go 1-2. So what's going to happen is you are going to potentially have lots of ties. And so by 1800, this was evident. Thomas Jefferson was the Democratic Republican presidential candidate, and his vice presidential candidate was Aaron Burr. And this happened. They were running on the same ticket, but they tied. Aaron Burr did not want to concede. He's like, "Hey, I have a chance to maybe be president." And so they fought it out in the House. The House of Representatives kept voting and voting and voting, and through 36 votes, there was a tie. Behind the scenes, Alexander Hamilton jumped in, got involved, and even though he didn't necessarily, love Jefferson, they were political opposites, he threw his support behind Jefferson. He got people who supported him to support Jefferson. And so Thomas Jefferson won the presidency. And then Aaron Burr was so mad that Alexander Hamilton sort of screwed him out of that, as he did earlier with a race for governor. That Aaron Burr finally said, "That's enough, Hamilton. Challenge you to a duel." And Aaron Burr, who was the vice president, killed Alexander Hamilton. And so it's sort of a crazy situation, which would be an interesting movie in today's world. The 12th Amendment then was the result of this election. And so what this basically did is it just totally reformed the Electoral College. And so the Electoral College that we know now, that was from the 12th Amendment. So that's all laid out in the 12th Amendment, how that works. Now, 5 times in history, the candidate who won the most popular votes lost the presidency. Now, some of these are more interesting than others. In 1824, Andrew Jackson was running, and there were 4 candidates. Andrew Jackson won the most votes and the most electoral, but he did not have a majority, which is over half. So the top three candidates then go to the House, and the House gets to vote. Well, the fourth candidate, who was out of the running for the presidency, Henry Clay, he threw his support behind John Quincy Adams in a deal they made that got the nickname the corrupt bargain. And so the people who supported Clay now gave their support to John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay became Secretary of State and eventually had to drop the position. But Jackson was corrupt. That's why it's called the corrupt bargain. So, but a very interesting one. 1876 was really a crazy one. I won't get into it now, but behind the scenes, it was nuts. It was the Southern Democrat really won, but this was during Reconstruction, and so the Northerners who controlled Congress and the Republican Party, they basically picked three Southern states who would have voted Democratic. They said they didn't vote Democratic, and I'm sure. So they had a panel in a back room of supposedly 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent, all vote 8-7 on party lines, and award all 3 Southern states that would never have voted for the party of Lincoln after the Civil War. Those 3 Southern states all went with the Republican based on that vote, and so they stole the election from the Democrats in the South. The South got so mad that they threatened they would secede again, and nobody at all wanted a civil war. So the North and the national government said, okay, what can we do? And the South said, well, why don't you get rid of all of the federal troops in the South, stop Reconstruction, and then we'll accept your illegitimate president. And so that was the deal that was made. Reconstruction ended in 1876-77. 1888 was not interesting, really. It was just the way the math worked out. And so nothing. It's just that sometimes it could work, that you won more votes but did not win the right formula for the Electoral College. 2000 was a really interesting one. When we are in class, or if we do a live session here, then we'll get into the details of that. Florida was very controversial, and some other things in the country, issues with ballots, and there was a long delay. In fact, after the election, it was a little over a month, I believe, if I remember correctly, until Bush v. Gore went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, basically ended all the recounting that was taking place, and some would say gave the election to Bush or whatever. So Bush won after the election and a Supreme Court decision. So 1824, 1876, and 2000 were just crazy, dramatic elections, really. 2016, I mean, people got heated about it, and maybe people want to talk about Russia involvement or something, but in terms of the electoral part of it, it was literally just the way the math worked out. Hillary Clinton in some states dominated, like California and places, won lots of popular votes. Trump just won the right formula, and so he won the Electoral College, and he won. So show you, again, I won't get into any more to the 2000 election right now, but if you look down here, you can see what the Electoral College vote was in 2000. Remember, you need 270. So when Florida ended up a sort of late going to Bush, that may put him over the top. So, and one elector did not cast a vote. This is the way the election broke down in 2000 by county, but it is similar to this in every election. So red are Republican, blue are Democratic counties. And so the Republicans always win the more land mass, the bigger counties, the bigger electoral districts, whatever. And so the Democrats win the cities. And so in this case, Gore won the popular vote by quite a bit, but Bush won the majority of the land in the country. Which that doesn't really matter. But you can also see here where a little bit of where in blue where it's more Democratic, and in red where it's more Republican. In 2016, so this was Trump's win, you can see here also a couple things. It's generally always very liberal there and liberal up there. So these would be always sort of Democratic areas. This piece right here is always Republican. Generally now North Carolina has changed some, but in there is Republican, where North Carolina is a bit of a swing state. So what becomes the key, then other ones now, obviously Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, they're always Republican too. So then you can start to see swing states. Colorado's become a swing state, and Virginia and North Carolina and that whole Rust Belt area is really important. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan. All right, so, but also up here in the top right corner where we mentioned in the last lesson, Maine can split its electoral votes. And so Maine did that here. Maine had 3 that went to Hillary Clinton and 1 went to Trump. So that's how that works. Now, based on that, we talked about Maine. At the bottom, you really can't quite see the Maine districts, but there's only 2. And then you can see Nebraska's district at the top, and then they show close-ups of the 2 smaller districts right below it. But people over the years have thought, especially after the 2000 election, a lot of people were up in arms saying, this is crazy. How come Bush won the presidency and whatever? And much of the world was laughing at us. They don't get it. They're like, isn't it a democracy? Like, someone gets the most votes. Why do they not win, America? So I didn't hear a lot of this after 2016, but after the 2000 election, there was a lot of talk of changing electoral college. So a simple alternative would be to go to the popular vote, just to have the election based on whoever gets the most votes. You'd have to totally change the Constitution for that. The really small states in America would not ratify an amendment probably to change the Constitution, because if it was popular vote, a state like Montana or Alaska or Vermont or somewhere would be totally irrelevant. And they are sort of now anyways, but they have a little bit more say based on the Electoral College. So that probably is never going to happen. Some have said, why don't you make it some sort of proportional vote, which if you had a Republican and a Democratic candidate, and you had a system, let's say that in a state this was the popular vote count. If you had 10 electoral votes in today's world, so now it would be 10-0, and 10-0 doesn't really reflect 7-3. So some people have said, why don't you make it proportional? Why don't we do that? Okay, 7-3. I'd be okay with that, but the reality is that's never going to work, because the math would very rarely be this clear cut. What if it was 700,000 to 600,000 and a state had 3 electoral votes? You can't break up electoral votes, and so it's just the math makes it just way too difficult. And some would say, and if your goal is to make this total here accurately reflect that, rather than go to this, why don't you just go with that? Why don't you just go with the popular vote? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So what some people have said then is, why don't they split by congressional district, right? Like Maine and Nebraska. And so Maine and Nebraska do it that way. Now, you can see in Maine, in the last election, this big district up here went to Trump. And then this one down here, the smaller district, went to Hillary Clinton. So if you look at Nebraska in the top, Nebraska has 3 congressional districts, which means Nebraska, so we'll just use Nebraska. So Nebraska has 5 electoral votes. Okay? So they have 5 electoral votes. So you look up here, and if you can look up on the top right, so you have a small one here. So this would be the most likely to be Democratic. There's Omaha in there. And then the big one here, which is mostly cornfields, not many people live there. That's why these have to be the same population-wise, not land-wise. So let's say it's this election, and it's in the 2000 election, it's Trump and Biden. Well, unless something dramatic happens in the next couple of months, Trump's going to win overall the state of Nebraska. So Trump would get a +2. Just for winning the whole state, he would get +2. Now you would look at the 3 congressional districts. So we'll say that this big one here goes to Trump. There's 1. And let's just give Biden, because back in, I think it was 2012, this did happen with Obama. Obama won 1 district here. So we got 1 electoral vote. So let's say that this one here is going to go to Biden. He gets a +1. And then we have to deal with this one here. It's smaller than bigger here. So we'll just say, because normally we'd say Trump. Now, Lincoln is there, which is the college town, and so there are some more liberal voters. But let's say that Trump gets that. So what would happen is Trump would get 4 and Biden would get 1. So I'm a fan of this. I think this more accurately reflects what the actual vote in the state was. And so, but it would, it would be a state by state decision to do this, because it would be impossible probably to do a constitutional amendment. But anyway, we will stop there for today, but think about the Electoral College a little bit. Hopefully you all really understand it as you go through life, because it is confusing. There are some other things people have suggested that state laws could do to maybe adjust the way the Electoral College works, but for now we will stop with that. I appreciate it. Thank you.